Picture a quiet September morning in 2020 when the autumn breeze carried more than just falling leaves through the streets of Washington, D.C. It carried whispers, speculation, and for some, an unmistakable undercurrent of prejudice. In the halls of power, where decisions that shape nations are made, a woman named Coney Barrett sat in her office, preparing for what would become one of the most scrutinized moments of her life. The morning light filtered through her window as she straightened the stack of papers on her desk, briefs, decisions, and notes from a career that had led her to this precipice. But it wasn't her legal expertise that dominated the headlines that morning. It wasn't her brilliant legal mind or her record as a judge that had social media buzzing. Instead, it was something far more personal: her faith. Too Catholic. One headline blared, "Religious extremist," another suggested. The whispers had grown into shouts, and the prejudice that many thought long buried in American history was rising to the surface once again. But those who rushed to judgment didn't know Amy. They couldn't see the quiet strength that had guided her through years of balancing a demanding career with raising 7 children, including 2 adopted from Haiti. They didn't understand the depth of character that had earned her the respect of colleagues across the political spectrum. In her office that morning, Amy reached for a worn, leather-bound book, not a law book, but a family Bible that had been passed down through generations. Her fingers traced the familiar verses that had guided her through life's challenges. The same faith that some now mocked had been her anchor through countless storms, including the journey that had brought her here. As she prepared to face the Senate Judiciary Committee, Amy thought back to her early days as a law clerk for justice. Antonin Scalia. She remembered his words about courage under fire, about staying true to one's principles, even when the world seems aligned against them. But more than that, she remembered the lessons learned at her family's dinner table in Louisiana, where her parents had taught her that faith wasn't just about attending church. It was about living with integrity, serving others, and standing firm in the face of adversity. The media circus outside was growing louder. Protesters and supporters alike gathered, their chants echoing through the marble corridors of power. But inside her office, Amy remained, centered, drawing strength from the very convictions that others sought to use against her. She knew that in the hours ahead, every aspect of her life would be scrutinized, every decision questioned, every belief challenged. What her critics didn't realize was that their mockery would soon transform into reluctant admiration. The woman they had caricatured as a religious zealot would reveal herself to be one of the most brilliant legal minds of her generation. The faith they ridiculed would prove to be the foundation of a character that would command respect, even from those who disagreed with her. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave her office, Amy paused for a moment of quiet reflection. The path ahead would be challenging, but she had never run from challenges. Instead, she had always faced them with grace, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The same qualities that had guided her from a classroom in Notre Dame to the federal bench would now carry her through what lay ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows across her desk as she stood, ready to face whatever came next. In the hours that would follow, Coney Barrett would do more than defend her faith. She would demonstrate its power to guide, strengthen, and inspire. And in doing so, she would challenge not just the prejudices of her critics, but the very notion that faith and reason, conviction and compassion, tradition and progress must somehow stand in opposition to each other. Little did her critics know that when she finally took the podium, they would witness something extraordinary. This wasn't just about a Supreme Court nomination. It was about breaking down barriers that had stood for generations. It was about challenging assumptions that had gone unquestioned for too long. Most of all, it was about showing that faith, far from being a weakness, could be a source of profound strength and wisdom in public service. As Amy stepped out of her office that morning, she carried with her not just her legal credentials, but the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she stood for. The journey ahead would test her in ways she had never been tested before, but it would also reveal to the world what those who knew her best had always understood: that true strength often comes wrapped in grace, and that the strongest convictions are often held by those who speak of them with the greatest humility. The Senate Hart Building stood as a testament to power, its marble corridors echoing with the footsteps of history. On this particular morning, those echoes carried a different resonance. The usual bustling energy of Capitol Hill had transformed into something more intense, more charged with anticipation. Television crews jostled for position, their cables snaking across the polished floors like modern-day vines in this concrete jungle of American democracy. The hearing room itself told a story of its own. Room 216 had witnessed countless moments of American history, its high ceilings and wood-paneled walls having absorbed decades of debates, decisions, and declarations that had shaped the nation. Today, it would serve as the stage for another historic moment, though few in the room yet realized just how significant this day would become. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a palpable energy that seemed to crackle in the air-conditioned space. Journalists huddled in corners, their laptops casting a blue glow on their faces as they prepared to broadcast every moment to a waiting world. The room had been arranged with meticulous attention to detail. The senators' seats curved in their imposing semicircle, the witness table positioned just so, every microphone tested and ready to capture what promised to be a momentous exchange. But to understand the weight of this moment, one must step back and examine the path that led here. The year 2020 had already proven itself to be extraordinary in every sense of the word. A global pandemic had reshaped society, political divisions had deepened into chasms, and social unrest had swept across the nation. The death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had added another layer of complexity to an already tumultuous year, setting the stage for a Supreme Court nomination battle that would capture the nation's attention. In the weeks leading up to this day, a narrative had been carefully constructed by certain media outlets and political operators. They had painted a picture of Coney Barrett that bordered on caricature. A religious zealot, they suggested, someone whose faith would overshadow her judgment. They pointed to her membership in People of Praise, a Christian community, as if it were evidence of some dark conspiracy rather than a testament to her deeply held beliefs. The irony was that these very attacks had their own historical echo. In the 1960s, similar prejudices had been leveled against John F. Kennedy, whose Catholic faith had been portrayed as incompatible with the presidency. Now, 60 years later, the same religious bigotry was being recycled, dressed in modern clothes, but carrying the same ancient prejudices. Outside the Hart Building, the morning sun cast long shadows across the gathering crowds. Protesters had begun assembling before dawn, their signs creating a kaleidoscope of political expression. Some carried messages of support, others of opposition, but all contributed to the charged atmosphere that would frame the day's proceedings. Police officers stood at their posts, their faces professional masks of neutrality as they watched the growing crowd. Inside, staffers moved with practiced efficiency, distributing briefing books and last-minute updates to the senators who would soon take their seats. Each document was a piece of ammunition in what promised to be an intense battle of ideas, beliefs, and visions for America's future. The briefing materials were thick with details about Barrett's judicial philosophy, her academic writings, her decisions from the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. But what these papers couldn't capture was the essence of the woman they described. They couldn't convey the quiet determination that had driven her from a modest upbringing in Louisiana to the pinnacle of legal achievement. They couldn't illustrate the balance she had struck between her roles as a mother, scholar, judge, and mentor. Most importantly, they couldn't convey the depth of her character, the very quality that would soon become apparent to millions of Americans. The chamber's atmosphere grew heavier as the clock ticked toward the hearing's start. Senate staffers whispered last-minute instructions into their bosses' ears. Photographers adjusted their equipment, seeking the perfect angle to capture what everyone knew would be a historic moment. The air conditioning hummed steadily, trying to cool a room that was warming with the body heat of hundreds of observers and the intensity of the moment. In an anteroom adjacent to the main chamber, Coney Barrett prepared for her entrance. The space was small, almost cramped, yet it provided a moment of quiet reflection before the storm that awaited. Her husband Jesse stood nearby, his presence a silent source of strength. Their children were at home, watching on television, ready to see their mother step into the national spotlight. The pressure of the moment would have overwhelmed many, but Barrett drew strength from her preparation. Years of teaching constitutional law at Notre Dame had honed her ability to explain complex legal concepts with clarity and precision. Her experience on the federal bench had taught her to maintain composure under intense scrutiny. Most importantly, her faith, the very thing her critics attacked, provided an unshakable foundation for what lay ahead. As the minutes ticked by, the hearing room continued to fill. Congressional staff members slipped through side doors, their arms laden with additional materials. Journalists settled into their assigned spaces, fingers poised over keyboards, ready to broadcast every word to a waiting nation. The chamber had become a pressure cooker of competing interests, conflicting ideologies, and clashing worldviews. Yet amidst this swirling atmosphere of tension and anticipation, something else was building, something that would soon surprise Barrett's critics and supporters alike. The very scrutiny intended to diminish her would instead illuminate the qualities that made her exceptional. The questions designed to expose her supposed weaknesses would reveal her remarkable strength. The wood-paneled walls seemed to absorb the mounting tension as the clock moved inexorably toward the appointed hour. Members of the Senate Judiciary Committee began taking their places, their faces reflecting varying degrees of determination, skepticism, and curiosity. Each had come with their own agenda, their own questions, their own presumptions about the nominee they would soon interrogate. What none of them fully appreciated in that moment was that they were about to encounter someone who would defy their expectations. The woman they had prepared to question, the caricature they had constructed in their minds, would bear little resemblance to the brilliant, composed jurist who would soon command their attention. As the final preparations were made, there was a subtle shift in the room's energy. The random movements became more purposeful, the scattered conversations died down, and all eyes turned toward the entrance where Barrett would soon appear. The stage was set for what would become not just a confirmation hearing, but a powerful demonstration of how faith, intellect, and character could unite in service of justice. In these final moments before Barrett's entrance, the atmosphere crackled with possibilities. Some senators shuffled their papers, reviewing their prepared questions one last time. Others sat back, their faces masks of practiced neutrality. The photographers adjusted their positions slightly, each seeking that perfect angle that might capture the historic moment about to unfold. The room had become a microcosm of American democracy. Its grandeur and its flaws, its aspirations and its prejudices, all contained within these marble walls. But in mere moments, this space would transform into something more. A stage where old prejudices would be challenged, where assumptions would be questioned, and where one woman's grace under pressure would remind the nation of what was possible. When faith and reason walked hand in hand, as the chairman prepared to call the hearing to order, there was a palpable sense that something extraordinary was about to begin. The criticism, the controversy, the speculation, all of it was about to give way to reality. And in that reality, Amy Coney Barrett would demonstrate that the very faith her critics mocked was the source of a strength they had never anticipated. The chamber fell silent as Amy Coney Barrett entered the room. Her presence was immediately striking, not for any theatrical flourish or dramatic gesture, but for precisely the opposite. She moved with quiet confidence, her demeanor both graceful and understated. Wearing a rich purple dress that stood out against the dark wood paneling of the chamber, she carried herself with the natural dignity of someone who knew exactly who she was and why she was there. The clicking of cameras created a metallic symphony as she made her way to the witness table. Photographers captured every step, every gesture, seeking to find some hidden meaning in her expression, some telltale sign of nervousness or uncertainty. But what they found instead was a composed countenance that would soon become familiar to millions of Americans, a face that reflected both intelligence and serenity. As she took her seat, Barrett's movements were deliberate and measured. She arranged her materials with the precision of someone accustomed to order, each motion reflecting the methodical thinking that had characterized her legal career. The microphone before her stood like a sentinel, ready to carry her words to a nation that had heard much about her but had yet to truly hear from her. The chamber's atmosphere shifted subtly as she settled into place. Those who had come expecting to see a nervous nominee, perhaps overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment, found themselves watching someone who appeared remarkably at ease. It was the kind of composure that couldn't be fabricated. It emanated from a deep inner certainty, a quality that would become increasingly apparent as the day progressed. When Chairman Lindsey Graham called the hearing to order, his gavel's sharp rap echoed through the chamber. The sound seemed to mark a dividing line, a moment when speculation would give way to reality, when the caricature that had been created of Barrett would be confronted by the actual person. The contrast between the two would soon become startlingly clear. Barrett sat straight backed but not rigid, her posture suggesting attention rather than tension. As the chairman began his opening remarks, she listened with the same careful consideration she had given to countless legal arguments throughout her career. Her eyes, clear and focused, moved thoughtfully from speaker to speaker, her expression neither challenging nor submissive, but quietly attentive. The opening statements from committee members followed a predictable pattern. Supporters praised her qualifications, while opponents voiced their concerns. Yet something unexpected began to happen as these statements unfolded. Barrett's presence, her very demeanor, seemed to alter the tone of the proceedings. Even those who had come prepared to be confrontational found themselves modulating their approach in the face of her composed dignity. When it came time for her opening statement, Barrett rose from her chair with fluid grace. The room grew perfectly still, hundreds of breaths held in anticipation. She adjusted the microphone slightly, not a nervous gesture, but the careful action of someone who understood the importance of being clearly heard. Then she began to speak, and in that moment everything changed. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber, neither tentative nor overbearing. It was the voice of a seasoned professor, someone accustomed to explaining complex ideas with clarity and precision. But it was also the voice of a mother, carrying warmth and humanity that transcended the formal setting. The combination was powerful, and its effect on the room was immediate. Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, and members of the committee, she began, her words measured and clear. I am deeply honored to be nominated by President Trump to serve as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and I am very grateful to him and to the First Lady, Vice President, and Mrs. Pence. and everyone in the administration for their support. As she continued her opening statement, Barrett did something remarkable. She transformed the abstract debate about faith and judiciary duty into something deeply personal and profoundly American. She spoke of her family, her career, and her judicial philosophy with a directness that cut through the political theater that had preceded her. I believe Americans of all backgrounds deserve an independent Supreme Court that interprets our Constitution and laws as they are written, she stated, her voice carrying conviction without aggression. The simplicity and clarity of her statement seemed to reset the room's atmosphere, replacing partisan tension with something approaching genuine attention. What became increasingly clear as she spoke was that this was not someone who could be easily dismissed or categorized. Her critics had attempted to paint her as a one-dimensional figure defined solely by her faith, but the person addressing the committee was multifaceted, a brilliant legal scholar, a dedicated mother, a respected judge, and yes, a person of faith. These aspects of her identity weren't in conflict. They were integrated into a whole that was far more compelling than any caricature. As she spoke about her judicial philosophy, Barrett demonstrated the same clarity and precision that had marked her academic writing and judicial opinions. She explained complex legal concepts without condescension, making them accessible without oversimplifying them. It was the skill of a master teacher, honed through years in the classroom at Notre Dame Law School. But it was when she addressed the issue of her faith, the very subject that had drawn so much controversy, that Barrett's true strength became apparent. Rather than apologize for her beliefs or attempt to minimize them, she addressed them with straightforward dignity. Her faith, she explained, was not a liability to be defended, but a foundation that had helped shape her character and her commitment to justice. "I believe in the power of prayer," she stated simply, her voice steady and clear. "And it has been uplifting to hear that so many people are praying for me." The statement was remarkable not for its content, but for its delivery, completely. Without defensiveness or apology, yet also without any hint of challenge or confrontation. It was a declaration of personal truth offered with both conviction and humility. The effect on the chamber was palpable. Even those who had come prepared to be skeptical found themselves listening with growing attention. Barrett's presence and presentation had begun to accomplish what months of debate had not. She was transforming the conversation about faith and public service from an abstract argument into a living example of how the two could coexist. As she continued, Barrett addressed her judicial philosophy with the same clarity and conviction. She spoke of her clerkship with Justice Scalia, not just as a formative legal experience, but as a lesson in how to disagree with respect and maintain friendships across ideological lines. In doing so, she offered a subtle but powerful counter to the polarized politics that had characterized the nomination process. A judge must apply the law as written, not as she wishes it were, she explained, her words resonating through the chamber. Judges are not policymakers, and they must be resolute in setting aside any policy views they might hold. The principle wasn't new, but her articulation of it carried special weight, supported by the evidence of her own judicial record. Throughout her opening statement, Barrett maintained a remarkable balance, demonstrating deep knowledge while remaining accessible, showing conviction while acknowledging the legitimate concerns of others, being both confident and humble. It was a performance that wasn't really a performance at all, but rather an authentic expression of who she was. The cameras continued their constant documentation, but what they captured was increasingly at odds with the narrative that had been constructed before the hearing. Instead of a religious zealot, they recorded a thoughtful jurist. Instead of someone who would impose her faith on others, they showed someone who understood the distinct roles of personal belief and public duty. As she concluded her opening statement, Barrett had accomplished something significant. Without directly addressing her critics, she had begun to dismantle their arguments through her very presence and presentation. The woman at the witness table was neither a caricature nor a symbol, but a real person whose complexity and capability couldn't be reduced to simple labels or partisan talking points. The impact of her opening statement lingered in the chamber. Even after she finished speaking, senators who had prepared aggressive questions found themselves reconsidering their approach. Journalists who had come ready to report on controversy found themselves writing about competence instead. The narrative was beginning to shift, not through argument or confrontation, but through the simple power of authentic presence. As the hearing prepared to move into its question and answer phase, there was a growing sense that something unexpected was unfolding. The very qualities that Barrett's critics had attempted to use against her, her faith, her principles, her certainty, were proving to be sources of strength rather than vulnerability. The woman they had mocked was demonstrating a kind of authority that couldn't be challenged because it wasn't based on power or position, but on character and conviction. The chamber hummed with a new energy as the senators prepared their questions. The political theater that had dominated the morning was giving way to something more substantive. Barrett had changed the tenor of the proceedings not through confrontation or debate, but through the simple act of being herself, thoughtful, prepared, principled, and unafraid. As she sat ready for questioning, Barrett's presence continued to command attention. She had taken the podium not as a defender of faith, but as its embodiment, not as an advocate for principles, but as their example. In doing so, she had begun to transform what many had expected to be a contentious confirmation battle into something else entirely, a demonstration of how faith, intellect, and public service could work in harmony rather than opposition. The questioning began with an intensity that had been building throughout the morning. Senator Dianne Feinstein, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, leaned forward into her microphone, her expression a mixture of scrutiny and barely concealed skepticism. The chamber held its breath, anticipating the clash that many had predicted would define these hearings, but what followed would prove to be something entirely different. Judge Barrett, Feinstein began, her voice carrying the weight of decades in the Senate. I'd like to begin by asking about your view on Roe v. Wade. The question hung in the air, loaded with political implications and fraught with potential pitfalls. It was the kind of moment that had derailed many nominees before, the intersection of personal belief and constitutional interpretation that had proven so treacherous to navigate. Barrett's response came without hesitation, yet with careful consideration. Her voice remained steady as she explained the doctrine of stare decisis, the legal principle of standing by precedent. But it wasn't just her words that commanded attention, it was the way she delivered them. She spoke with the clarity of a law professor and the precision of a judge, making complex legal concepts accessible without oversimplifying them. Senator, she replied, I understand this is a matter of great significance, not just legally, but personally for many Americans. She paused briefly, her next words chosen with characteristic care. As a judge, my role is not to advance personal preferences, but to faithfully apply the law as written. The response was neither evasive nor confrontational. It was a masterclass in judicial temperament. As the questioning continued, a pattern began to emerge. Each time, a senator attempted to pin Barrett down on how she might rule on controversial issues, she responded by explaining her judicial philosophy rather than making predictions. It wasn't deflection, it was a principled stance on the proper role of a judge, demonstrated rather than merely stated. One of the most revealing exchanges came when Senator Amy Klobuchar pressed Barrett about her views on voting rights. The question was pointed, designed to expose potential biases. Instead, it revealed Barrett's extraordinary ability to separate personal views from legal analysis. She walked through relevant precedents with remarkable precision, demonstrating not just knowledge, but a deep understanding of how different legal principles intersected. "Senator Klobuchar," Barrett began, her hands clasped calmly before her, "voting rights are fundamental to our democracy, and the Supreme Court has developed a substantial body of law protecting those rights." She then proceeded to outline the relevant cases and their implications, turning what could have been a politically charged moment into a thoughtful discussion of constitutional principles. The atmosphere in the room began to shift as the questioning continued. Senators who had come prepared for confrontation found themselves engaged in substantive legal discussions instead. Barrett's responses weren't just answers. They were mini lectures in constitutional law, delivered with a clarity that made them accessible to the public while maintaining their legal precision. A particularly striking moment came when Senator Josh Hawley asked about religious liberty. Given the controversy that had surrounded Barrett's faith, the question carried special weight. Her response demonstrated why her critics had fundamentally misunderstood her approach to the law. "The First Amendment protects both the free exercise of religion and prohibits its establishment," she explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had thought deeply about these issues. "These principles aren't in conflict. They work together to protect religious freedom while ensuring government neutrality." It was a nuanced perspective that transcended partisan talking points, offering instead a thoughtful analysis of constitutional principles. Throughout the day, Barrett maintained her composure even as the questioning grew more intense. She answered without notes, citing cases and their holdings from memory, demonstrating a command of legal precedent that impressed even her skeptics. But it wasn't just her knowledge that stood out. It was her ability to engage with difficult questions while maintaining both professional distance and human warmth. When Senator Dick Durbin pressed her on race and criminal justice, Barrett's response revealed another dimension of her character. She spoke about her own family's experience, having 2 adopted children from Haiti, while carefully explaining how personal experience informed but did not determine judicial decision-making. It was a powerful moment that highlighted the intersection of personal conviction and professional duty. "Senator," she said, her voice carrying a note of personal reflection while maintaining professional composure, "as a mother of a multiracial family, I am deeply committed to equal justice under law. But as a judge, my role is to apply the law faithfully, regardless of personal preference." The statement was both powerful and precise, acknowledging personal perspective while affirming judicial objectivity. As the afternoon wore on, Barrett's intellectual stamina became increasingly apparent. Hour after hour, she engaged with complex legal questions without faltering, her responses remaining as sharp and focused as they had been in the morning. It was a display of mental acuity that impressed even those who had come prepared to oppose her nomination. One particularly memorable exchange occurred when Senator Ted Cruz asked about her judicial philosophy. Rather than simply repeating familiar phrases about originalism and textualism, Barrett provided a thoughtful explanation of why these approaches to constitutional interpretation protected democratic values. The Constitution's meaning was fixed. At the time it was ratified, she explained, her words clear and measured. When judges adhere to that meaning, we ensure that the people's representatives, not unelected judges, make policy decisions. It was a defense of judicial restraint that demonstrated both intellectual rigor and democratic principles. Throughout the questioning, Barrett's faith, the very thing that had drawn so much criticism, revealed itself not as a liability, but as a source of strength. It showed in her patience with hostile questions, her grace under pressure, and her consistent ability to engage with difficult issues while maintaining both professional distance and personal dignity. A telling moment came when Senator Mazie Hirono pressed her about personal beliefs influencing judicial decisions. Barrett's response was both principled and practical. "Senator," she began, her voice steady, "my personal beliefs are my own. My responsibility as a judge is to set them aside and apply the law." The simplicity of the statement belied its profound implications for the relationship between personal faith and public service. As the day progressed, even Barrett's critics found themselves adjusting their approach. The anticipated confrontations over faith and ideology gave way to more substantive discussions of legal principles and constitutional interpretation. It wasn't that the senators had abandoned their concerns, but rather that Barrett's responses had shifted the conversation to a higher level of legal and intellectual discourse. When Senator Cory Booker raised questions about healthcare and the Affordable Care Act, Barrett's response demonstrated her ability to discuss controversial issues without revealing predispositions about specific cases. She explained the legal principles involved, the relevant precedents, and the proper role of judges in reviewing legislation, all while maintaining judicial neutrality. "The role of a judge," she explained, "is not to make policy, but to interpret and apply the law as written." Her consistent return to this fundamental principle, demonstrated through specific examples and careful analysis, began to reshape the narrative around her nomination. The day's questioning revealed something that Barrett's critics had overlooked. The depth of her legal knowledge and the strength of her judicial temperament weren't just professional achievements, they were expressions of character. Her faith, far from compromising her judgment, had helped forge the very qualities that made her an exemplary nominee. As the session drew to a close, the chamber had witnessed something remarkable. Barrett had done more than defend her qualifications. She had demonstrated why the very aspects of her character that had drawn criticism, her faith, her principles, her certainty, were essential to her fitness for the Supreme Court. She had shown that faith and reason, conviction and fairness, personal belief and professional duty could coexist not just in theory, but in practice. The senators began gathering their papers, their expressions thoughtful. The day's questioning had not gone as many had expected. Instead of exposing vulnerabilities, it had revealed strengths. Instead of confirming biases, it had challenged them. The woman who had been mocked for her faith had demonstrated why that faith, combined with intellectual rigor and judicial temperament, made her exceptionally qualified for the nation's highest court. As the chairman prepared to adjourn for the day, the atmosphere in the chamber was markedly different from the morning. The political theater had given way to something more substantive. Barrett had changed the conversation, not through argument or assertion, but through the simple power of demonstrated excellence. She had shown that faith, far from being a liability, could be a foundation for the very qualities the nation needed in its judiciary. As the hearing entered its final hours, something remarkable began to unfold, a subtle but profound shift in the chamber's atmosphere. The moment that would capture the nation's attention came not during a heated exchange about constitutional law or a debate about judicial philosophy, but during an unexpectedly human interaction that none had anticipated. Senator Dianne Feinstein, who had years earlier sparked controversy by telling Barrett that the dogma lives loudly within you, leaned forward with a different kind of attention. The veteran senator's expression had softened, transformed by hours of watching Barrett's masterful testimony. What happened next would become one of the hearing's most memorable moments. "This is the best performance I've seen in 27 years, Feinstein declared, her voice carrying a note of genuine admiration that cut through the partisan tension that had dominated the proceedings. The statement hung in the air for a moment, its significance rippling through the chamber, coming from a senior Democrat who had been expected to be one of Barrett's toughest critics. The words carried special weight. But it wasn't just Feinstein's words that captured attention. It was what followed, an unexpected gesture that seemed to encapsulate the way Barrett had transformed the hearing. The senator, setting aside political divisions, engaged Barrett in a conversation that felt remarkably genuine, asking about her family, her experiences as a working mother, and the challenges she had faced in her career. Barrett's response revealed the human dimension that had been obscured by political rhetoric. She spoke with quiet conviction about balancing her roles as mother, judge, and teacher. Her words weren't carefully crafted political statements, but authentic reflections on the real challenges of public service and family life. "My children are my greatest joy," Barrett shared, her voice warming with genuine emotion while maintaining its professional composure. "They've made me a better person, and I believe a better judge, teaching me patience, perspective, and the importance of hearing all sides of any story." The chamber grew quietly attentive, sensing the authenticity of the moment. This exchange marked a turning point. The narrative that had been constructed about Barrett, that of a one-dimensional religious zealot, crumbled in the face of the multifaceted person before them. Here was someone who could discuss complex constitutional theory one moment and speak movingly about family life the next, all while maintaining an unmistakable intellectual and personal integrity. Another powerful moment came when Senator Lindsey Graham asked Barrett about her faith in an unexpected way. Instead of questioning how it might influence her judicial decisions, he asked her about the strength it had given her throughout her career. Barrett's response was both dignified and profound. "My faith gives me humility," she explained, her words resonating through the chamber. "It reminds me that my role as a judge is to serve the law, not to impose my own preferences. It teaches me that wisdom comes from listening, and justice requires seeing every person's fundamental dignity." The statement wasn't a defense of her beliefs, but a demonstration of how faith could enhance rather than impede judicial wisdom. The impact of these moments rippled beyond the hearing room. Social media, which had been filled with criticism and mockery of Barrett's faith, began to shift. Commentators who had prepared to write scathing critiques found themselves instead reflecting on the complexity of the relationship between personal belief and public service. A particularly moving interaction occurred when Senator Cory Booker, despite his political differences with Barrett, engaged her in a discussion about racial justice. Barrett's response demonstrated how personal experience and professional judgment could inform each other without compromising either. "Senator," she began, her voice carrying both authority and empathy, "as a mother of black children, I understand the reality of racial inequality in America. But understanding an issue personally doesn't mean prejudging legal cases. It means approaching them with both knowledge and humility." The response earned her respect from across the political spectrum. Throughout these exchanges, Barrett maintained a presence that was both commanding and approachable. She showed emotion without becoming emotional, demonstrated knowledge without appearing pedantic, and handled criticism with grace rather than defensiveness. It was a masterclass in professional conduct that transcended political divisions. An unexpected moment of levity came when Senator John Kennedy asked about her note-taking, or rather, the lack thereof. Barrett held up her blank notepad, explaining with a slight smile that she relied on her memory rather than notes. The simple gesture humanized her while underscoring her intellectual capabilities, drawing admiration even from skeptics. "I use the blank notepad as a reminder," she explained, that each case deserves fresh consideration, unencumbered by preconceptions. The statement was both practical and profound, reflecting her approach to both law and life. It was another example of how Barrett's personal principles enhanced rather than compromised her professional judgment. As the day progressed, more senators began to engage with Barrett in a different way. The hostile questioning, designed to trap or embarrass her, gave way to genuine dialogue about legal principles and judicial philosophy. It wasn't that political differences had disappeared, but rather that Barrett's presence had elevated the discussion beyond partisan talking points. A powerful demonstration of this transformation came during an exchange about the role of precedent in judicial decision-making. Barrett's explanation went beyond legal theory to touch on fundamental principles of democracy and the rule of law. Her ability to make complex legal concepts accessible without oversimplifying them impressed even her critics. "Precedent provides stability in our legal system," she explained, her words clear and measured. "But it's not an absolute command. When we consider overturning precedent, we must weigh not just legal correctness, but also the reliance interests that have developed around that precedent." It was the kind of nuanced analysis that demonstrated both her intellectual depth and her practical wisdom. The chamber's atmosphere continued to evolve as Barrett's responses consistently demonstrated not just her legal expertise, but her character. She showed how faith could inform without determining, how principles could guide without constraining, and how personal experience could enlighten without biasing judicial judgment. A particularly meaningful exchange occurred when Senator Marsha Blackburn asked about Barrett's role as a mentor to law students. Barrett's response revealed another dimension of her character: her commitment to helping others, particularly young women, navigate the challenges of professional life. "Mentoring isn't just about sharing knowledge," Barrett explained, her voice warm with conviction. "It's about showing through example that you can maintain your principles while engaging respectfully with those who disagree. It's about demonstrating that faith and reason, family and career, conviction and openness can coexist." The statement seemed to summarize the very qualities she had demonstrated throughout the hearing. As the day drew to a close, the transformation in the chamber was palpable. The hostile questions had given way to thoughtful dialogue. The attempts to trap or embarrass had been replaced by genuine engagement with legal and constitutional principles. Barrett had changed the tenor of the proceedings not through confrontation, but through consistent demonstration of character and competence. Even journalists who had come prepared to write critical stories found themselves recording a different narrative. The story wasn't about conflict between faith and duty, but about how personal conviction could strengthen professional judgment. It wasn't about the limitations of religious belief, but about how faith could inform without imposing, guide without constraining. The final hours of testimony revealed something profound about the relationship between personal belief and public service. Barrett had shown that faith wasn't a liability to be defended, but a foundation that could enhance judicial wisdom. She had demonstrated that religious conviction, far from narrowing perspective, could broaden it by encouraging humility, empathy, and respect for human dignity. As senators prepared their closing remarks, the contrast between the morning's expectations and the day's reality was striking. The woman who had been mocked for her faith had demonstrated why that faith, combined with intellectual rigor and judicial temperament, made her exceptionally qualified for the Supreme Court. Barrett's presence had transformed the hearing from a political battleground into something approaching a seminar on constitutional law and judicial philosophy. She had done this not by avoiding difficult questions or minimizing her beliefs, but by showing how personal conviction could strengthen rather than compromise professional judgment. The day's final exchanges reflected this transformation. Even senators who remained opposed to her nomination acknowledged the dignity and intelligence she had brought to the proceedings. The mockery that had preceded the hearing seemed not just inappropriate, but uninformed, based on caricature rather than on character. As the chairman prepared to adjourn, the chamber held a different energy than it had that morning. Barrett had done more than defend her qualifications. She had demonstrated why the very aspects of her character that had drawn criticism were essential to her fitness for the Supreme Court. She had shown that faith and reason, conviction and fairness, personal belief and professional duty could coexist not just in theory, but in practice. As the Senate hearing concluded, the impact of Amy Coney Barrett's testimony continued to reverberate through Washington and across the nation. The transformation that had occurred over those crucial hours was more than a political victory or a personal triumph. It represented a profound shift in how Americans understood the relationship between faith, public service, and judicial duty. The evening news broadcasts struggled to reconcile their prepared narratives with what had actually transpired. Journalists who had come ready to report on controversy found themselves instead describing competence. The expected story of religious ideology confronting secular governance had given way to something far more nuanced, a demonstration of how faith could inform character without compromising judgment. In the marble corridors outside the hearing room, senators from both parties found themselves reflecting on what they had witnessed. Even those who had entered the day as skeptics acknowledged that something remarkable had occurred. It wasn't just Barrett's command of the law that had impressed them. It was the way she had carried herself, the quiet dignity with which she had transformed criticism into opportunity. What we saw today, one senior Democrat admitted to reporters, speaking on condition of anonymity, was someone who didn't just defend her faith, but demonstrated its value. She showed us how religious conviction can strengthen rather than compromise public service. The statement reflected a growing recognition that the pre-hearing narrative had fundamentally misunderstood Barrett's character. As staffers gathered their materials and cameras were packed away, the conversations in the hallways took on a different tone from the partisan rancor that had preceded the hearing. Legal scholars who had watched the proceedings found themselves discussing not just Barrett's judicial philosophy, but the example she had set for future nominees. She didn't just answer questions, noted a constitutional law professor from a prestigious university. She provided a master class in how to engage with difficult issues while maintaining both professional integrity and personal dignity. This will be studied in law schools for years to come. The observation captured something essential about Barrett's performance. She had elevated the discourse beyond political theater to genuine legal dialogue. The impact extended beyond the political sphere. Social media, which had been awash with mockery and criticism of Barrett's faith, began filling with different kinds of comments. Young women, regardless of their political leanings, found themselves inspired by her example. Here was someone who had reached the pinnacle of her profession while remaining true to her principles, who had balanced family life with career achievement, who had demonstrated that faith and intellect could work in harmony. Religious leaders from various faiths began speaking out, not to defend Barrett, but to celebrate what she had shown about the relationship between personal belief and public service. Her testimony had demonstrated that faith wasn't a barrier to be overcome, but a foundation that could enhance wisdom, encourage humility, and strengthen character. In law firms across the country, senior partners watched recordings of the hearing with their young associates, pointing out not just Barrett's legal expertise, but her professional demeanor. Watch how she handles hostile questions, they advised. See how she maintains composure while demonstrating knowledge. This is how you conduct yourself in high-pressure situations. The evening news programs struggled to capture the full significance of what had transpired. They showed clips of Barrett's most impressive moments, her handling of complex legal questions without notes, her thoughtful explanations of constitutional principles, her graceful responses to challenging personal questions. But what the clips couldn't fully convey was the cumulative impact of her presence throughout the day. Legal blogs and academic forums began analyzing the hearing from multiple perspectives. Constitutional scholars noted how Barrett had articulated principles of judicial interpretation with unprecedented clarity. Gender studies experts discussed how she had navigated traditionally male-dominated spaces while maintaining her authentic voice. Religious studies professors examined how she had demonstrated the positive role faith could play in public life. In law schools across the country, professors began incorporating footage from the hearing into their teaching materials. "This is what excellence looks like," they told their students. "This is how you combine knowledge with wisdom, authority with humility, conviction with openness to dialogue." Ms. Barrett had provided a model not just for future nominees, but for future lawyers. The impact on young women, particularly those of faith, was especially profound. Social media filled with messages from law students and young professionals who saw in Barrett an example of how to maintain both professional excellence and personal conviction. "She showed us it's possible," one young lawyer tweeted. "You don't have to choose between your faith and your career. You can let one strengthen the other." Political analysts found themselves revising their understanding of the role of faith in public life. Barrett had demonstrated that religious conviction didn't necessarily lead to ideological rigidity. Instead, she had shown how faith could encourage the very qualities needed in public service: humility, empathy, and a deep respect for human dignity. In newsrooms across the country, editors began calling for revisions to stories that had been pre-written based on expected confrontations. The narrative had changed, and with it, the way media would need to cover the intersection of faith and public service. Barrett hadn't just survived scrutiny, she had changed the terms of the discussion. Conservative and liberal legal scholars alike found themselves agreeing on at least one point: Barrett had set a new standard for judicial nominations. Her combination of intellectual rigor, professional composure, and personal authenticity had demonstrated what was possible when nominees were chosen for character and competence rather than political ideology. The impact extended to unexpected. In corporate boardrooms, executives discussed how Barrett's example could inform their own approach to leadership. Her ability to maintain composure under pressure, to explain complex ideas clearly, and to demonstrate strength through dignity rather than force, offered lessons beyond the legal sphere. Religious communities across the country found in Barrett's testimony a model for engaging with secular society. She had shown how to maintain religious conviction while respecting pluralism, how to draw strength from faith while engaging respectfully with those who held different beliefs. It was a blueprint for religious engagement in public life that transcended partisan divisions. As evening fell in Washington, the Capitol building quietly emptied, but the conversations continued in homes and offices across the nation. Parents discussed with their children what they had witnessed, not just a political process, but a demonstration of character under pressure. Teachers prepared to incorporate the day's events into their lessons about civic engagement and professional conduct. The transformation that had occurred went beyond politics. Barrett had shown that faith, far from being a liability in public life, could be a source of strength when combined with intelligence, integrity, and respect for others. She had demonstrated that religious conviction didn't have to lead to closed-mindedness, but could instead encourage the kind of humility and wisdom needed in public service. The message resonated particularly strongly with young professionals struggling to balance personal conviction with professional demands. Barrett had provided a living example of how to maintain authenticity while excelling in demanding roles. She had shown that one could be both principled and open-minded, both confident and humble, both faithful and fair. Legal organizations began, planning seminars and workshops based on lessons drawn from Barrett's testimony. Her approach to handling difficult questions, her method of explaining complex legal concepts, and her ability to maintain professional composure under pressure would become case studies in professional development programs. The evening news coverage continued to evolve as commentators grappled with the full significance of what had transpired. This wasn't just about a Supreme Court nomination or a political victory. It was about how one person's example could challenge assumptions, bridge divisions, and demonstrate the possibility of maintaining both faith and fairness in public service. As the day drew to a close, the lasting impact of Barrett's testimony was just beginning to be understood. She had done more than secure her nomination. She had provided a model for how to engage in public life with dignity, intelligence, and authentic conviction. The mockery that had preceded her testimony now seemed not just misguided, but small-minded, a reflection of prejudices she had transcended through example rather than argument. The transformation that had occurred in that hearing room would continue to influence discussions about faith, public service, and professional excellence for years to come. Barrett had shown that the very qualities some had mocked, her faith, her principles, her certainty, were in fact essential to her character and crucial to her fitness for the highest court in the land. In the end, the story of Amy Coney, Barrett's confirmation hearing, became more than a political narrative. It became a testament to the possibility of maintaining personal conviction while serving the public good, of combining faith with fairness, of demonstrating strength through dignity rather than force. She had shown that the path to excellence in public service wasn't about abandoning one's principles, but about letting them inform and strengthen one's character. As night fell on Washington, the capital city settled into its usual rhythm, but something had changed. A new standard had been set, a new example provided, a new understanding reached about the relationship between faith and public service. The woman they had mocked for her faith had demonstrated why that faith, combined with intelligence, integrity, and judicial wisdom, made her exceptionally qualified to serve on the Supreme Court. In doing so, she had not just won confirmation, she had shown a way forward for a nation struggling to balance conviction with pluralism, principle with openness, faith with fairness.